CABE thanks our platinum level sponsor, Google, and National Geographic Cengage.
Jeff Duncan-Andrade is Associate Professor of Raza Studies and Race and Resistance Studies at San Francisco State University. He is also a founder of the Roses in Concrete Community School, a community responsive lab school in East Oakland and the Community Responsive Education Group. Dr. Duncan-Andrade's transformational work on the elements of effective teaching in schools serving poor students and working class children is recognized throughout the U.S. and as far abroad as New Zealand. His research interests and publications span the areas of urban schooling and curriculum change, urban teacher development and retention, critical pedagogy, and cultural and ethnic studies. Dr. Duncan-Andrade will be signing his books immediately following this general session here in Hall B. Join me in welcoming Dr. Jeff Andrade.
Good morning. That sounds about like my high school class. Let's try this again. Buenos dias. Okay, that was my fault. It's really good to be here. I am fighting that nasty superbug that's going around, so I'll just ask you for a little bit of leeway when I'm hacking throughout this presentation. As any good teacher, I drank my 22 ounces of hardcore coffee, and so I'm ready to go. Before we get into the talk that I was asked to do today, I just want to acknowledge that we're on indigenous land. And I come from the Opata people, which connects me to Mexicayo and Mayan traditions. And in our traditions, you don't just show up on somebody else's land and start speaking. You actually ask for permission to share palabra before you open your mouth. So I just want to ask permission of the indigenous people of this land and of my ancestors to share some palabra with you today. The talk that I was asked to do I started developing several years ago when I started being asked with a really high level of frequency by districts and schools to be a thought partner around the work that they were beginning to undertake with respect to equity. And so I was, read a number of strategic plans and concept papers about this equity project that they were going to undertake, and the frequency with which I saw these two words, equality and equity, used interchangeably in those plans was stunning to me. Because equality and equity, when we're talking about an educational paradigm, are fundamentally different. Okay? And so the move from an equal education system, which everybody in this room is crystal clear, we've never accomplished in this nation. And that's like Sesame Street level stuff, right? One for you, one for me, one for you, one for... We haven't even done that. Okay? And so the idea that schools, particularly schools that are serving our most vulnerable and our most wounded youth, are going to pivot from a system that they haven't effectively delivered on to an even more complex system is really troubling to me, because we haven't spent the time to really understand what we mean when we talk about equity. And if we don't really understand what we mean when we talk about equity, then equity will just be another program, just another game that we're playing around the pursuit of educational justice. So I started doing this talk as a way to really disentangle the concept of an equal education system from an equitable education system. And my understanding about the difference between these two words, equality and equity, really began to take shape for me about 6 years ago with the birth of my twin boys. So, Amaru, okay, now look, these are twins, okay, so they're literally separated by seconds at birth, right? My wife had a C-section, so it's like baby A, baby B, okay? So, for all intents and purposes, okay, these two boys are as equal as you're gonna get between two children, okay? And yet, they could not be more different. So, Amaru is constantly thirsty. So much so that this boy will literally drop a straw into like anything to try to extract liquid. Okay. In this case, he hit the jackpot, so you can see he's got a coconut there, so he's happy. Okay. Tayari is constantly hungry. Okay. So much so that this boy will literally store morsels of food on his shirt for later snacking. This is a picture of our family, literally the first time out of the house. Okay, do you see how big those boys are? Okay, this is the first. Anybody in here have multiples, twins, triplets? Okay, yeah, so y'all will understand what I'm talking about. Everybody else, you don't even get it. Okay? So first time out of the house. And we're at this place in Oakland called Lake Merritt where a lot of folks will gather. So we're out there, and this community member's walking by, and I'm like, hey, can you take a picture of our family? It's the first time out of the house. He takes this picture and hands me my phone back, and I'm looking at this picture, and I'm like, what is that? It's like, Tayari, come here, boy, come here. I bring Tayari over, and that is bark from that tree. All right, so when we're talking about a boy that's constantly hungry, we are literally talking about a boy that takes bark off of trees and eats it. So in this context, is this equal? What do you think? Okay, I got some no, I got some yes. I got some yes from down here. Who said yes down here? Okay, what? You are now in front of 2,000 people, okay? You ready? What's your name, bro? Carlos. Why do you say yes? Okay. All right. So he says it's equal because it's the same. Okay. And who said no? Okay, you say it's not equal. Why? Why you say it's not equal? Because they need different things. What's your name? Huh? Diane? Is it Diane? Okay. See, Diane, your problem is that when you look at these kinds of questions for young people, okay, you don't pull from here. You start from here and from here. Okay? And so what you did, Diane, is that you actually changed the question because it's the wrong question. Okay? So Carlos is right. Okay? This is the dictionary definition of equal. Okay? But you changed the question to, is this fair? And when we change that question, the answer is, of course, no, for the reasons that you said. Okay? So there is nothing in the definition of equality that talks about fairness. And when we're talking about a society that is so fundamentally and radically unequal, the only industrialized society to have committed 2 genocides, to have built its entire economy on the enslavement of African people and the theft of indigenous land. When we're talking about that society, to talk about an equal education system is absurd because we're so radically unequal. Maybe we get to a point one day when everybody's suffering matters the same in this society and we can start talking about equality and an equal education system. But until that day, to talk about equality when we have such radical inequality in our broader society doesn't make any sense for children, just as it doesn't make any sense for my 2 boys in that equation. Now, we've been at this equal education system since 1954, okay, with the Brown decision. Brown v. Board, okay, Supreme Court of the United States ruled that separate is by definition unequal. And then the nation sets out to pursue an equal education system in every part of our system. Now, it's been 6+ decades since the Supreme Court said that racial segregation in schools is illegal. Anybody know how much progress we've made in those 6 decades? How much have we desegregated our city schools? Let's do some prices right, okay? So throw some bids out there, 10%, 50%. How racially desegregated do you think we are from where we were in 1954? 3%, 30%. You can't vote negative in The Price is Right. Well, she's actually right. Gary Orfield, who's at UCLA, he runs the UCLA Civil Rights Project. Gary's a lawyer by training, but also an excellent educational historian. He has a research team that releases a report every 10 years on the progress we've made on Brown. And on their 60th anniversary report, what their data revealed is that city schools are more racially segregated now than they were before the Supreme Court said that's illegal. And that's the value of a policy, y'all. We will not policy our way out of this. Now, that does not mean that policy doesn't matter. Of course policy matters. But policy without attention to people on the ground that have to actually execute and implement that policy is just pomp and circumstance. Now, this policy, this national commitment to an equal education system has had an impact. And there's lots of data to suggest the quality of that impact. Now, y'all are data-driven, right? Y'all work in data-driven districts? No? Okay. Yeah, pretty much every district that I'm in, right, is talking about being data-driven, which I actually think is fantastic. I think we should be data-driven. Now, I'm from East Oakland. So for me to get from the airport to the hotel to here, right, I'm not from Long Beach. So I had to use this. My preferred navigation system is Waze. Okay, you can use whatever you like. But for me to get from where I was to here, okay, what did I have to put into Waze? Okay, an address or a destination, which Waze reads as what? As data. Now, what would have happened if I put the wrong address in? Somebody else would be up here faking it till they make it. And I'd be in some other location, right? But I'd still be data-driven. It's not about being data-driven. It's about being driven by the right data. And if you keep looking at the wrong data and ending up in the wrong place, don't blame Waze. It's user error. We keep ending up in the wrong place with the same group of kids year over year over year. Maybe we're looking at the wrong data. Because if you change the data you look at, it changes the questions you ask. And when you change the questions you ask, you change the answers you come up with. And if you end up in the wrong place after coming up with new answers, then you know you're still looking at the wrong data. We've got to change the data we're looking at if we're really going to impact the hearts and the minds of the children that we have historically and continually failed to reach. Now, here's some data for us on 6+ decades of an equal education system. Okay, not long before Arne Duncan left office, when Obama was still in the White House, okay, Arne Duncan was all over national TV lauding himself and the Obama administration for how much progress they'd made on high school graduation during their term. And at the time, I was teaching high school English literature at Fremont High School in Deep East Oakland, which is my neighborhood high school and arguably one of the 10 most distressed high schools in the nation. And so I'm having this moment of cognitive dissonance where I'm showing up every day, okay, into a high school that is under massive duress. And then I'm hearing the top education official in the United States say, we're doing better than ever. And so we pulled the data and we re-ran it. So this is not actually Arnie's map. Okay, this is a re-rendition of the map. And this, all we did was control for one thing. We controlled for income. So this is the high school graduation map for middle and high income children. Okay? And it probably doesn't shock anybody because it's no surprise that middle income and high income kids do pretty well in US public schools. That's the corresponding map for low income kids. And if that is not a national crisis, pray tell what is. And I know what y'all are thinking. Texas? Texas cheats. No, for real. For real. You don't remember the Texas miracle and the Texas state superintendent? Yeah, look it up. Hey? It wasn't no miracle. It was, unless cheating's a miracle. Tip to finish, edge to edge, coast to coast. Poor kids are failing in incredibly high numbers in our schools. And that's not even coding for race, because you know what happens when we add race, hey, to that formula. Here's some more data for us. The United States has the highest income distribution, wealth distribution gap in the history of the industrialized world. No nation has ever been more unequal in its distribution of wealth than we are, and we're trending the wrong way. This is our national incarceration data. We're also the champs at locking up our own citizens. No nation has more of its citizens per capita locked up than the United States. In point of fact, no one's even close. Russia is a distant second. There's a great website put out by Mother Jones called Debt to Society that actually tracks prison rates and prison investments all over the world. This is the Global Peace Index. The Global Peace Index is considered by many around the world as the gold standard for measuring peace and democracy in societies. Something that the so-called global leader in democracy would probably want to score well on. Okay, the Global Peace Index is used by the United Nations, it's used by the World Health Organization, it's used by UNESCO to measure, okay, the quality of peace and democracy in societies all over the world. In 2015, every time I show this slide, the same thing that's happening now happens, which is people stop looking at me and they start looking at the rankings. Because the US is obsessed with rankings. No, we did not make the top 15 in 2015. We were 94th. The 2018 index just came out, and now we're 121st. This is the impact of 6 decades of an equal education system in a radically unequal society. 1854, London, England. There was talk of total collapse of the city because there was a massive outbreak of cholera. And in a last-ditch effort to save the city, city officials sequestered some of the top medical minds in London. They put them in a room, locked them in, and said, "You're not coming out of here until you have a solution for cholera." So all these doctors are sitting around a table and they're knocking around all these ideas, and eventually one of them stands up. He says, this is absurd. I said, what do you mean? He says, every single solution we're coming up with defaults us to cholera. We're not trying to figure out how to end cholera. We're not trying to figure out how to eradicate cholera. We're trying to figure out how to live with cholera. And they said, yeah. He said, I didn't sign up to be a medical doctor to live in the conditions of sickness. I signed up to be a medical doctor to create the conditions of wellness. They said, well, you're not being realistic. You're not looking at the data. And I hear this said to teachers, school leaders, superintendents all the time that are talking about fundamental shifts in the way in which we move in schools. Not lipstick on the pig, not tweaking around the edges, not calling block scheduling as some massive innovation in schools, right? But saying, no, we need to fundamentally rethink what the hell are we doing here? Why are we taking children from their families at age 6 for 13 consecutive years for 8 hours a day? What is this project about? What is the fundamental purpose of public education in this pluralistic, multiracial democracy? Is it really test scores? For real? That's what we're about. Or is it something fundamentally different? Our unwillingness to revisit that foundational question leads us to keep tinkering around the edges on a ship that all of the data suggests is rapidly sinking. So this medical doctor amongst the top medical minds in London speaks a similar story. And he says, if that's what it means to be part of your medical association, to adhere to principles that are clearly making us sick, then I don't want to be part of your medical association. These top medical minds looked back at him and said, cool. And showed him the door. This medical doctor's name was John Snow. No, not that John Snow. That John Snow. John Snow leaves the meeting of the top medical minds in London and he hits the streets. And he becomes an ethnographer of the community that he served. The best teachers, the best school leaders that I'm around are first and foremost ethnographers of the communities that they serve. They're embedded in the barrio. They're embedded in the neighborhoods that they're serving, so that they know that what they're actually giving to children and families is a direct response to the material conditions of their lives, not what's most convenient for the school or the district or the state. So John Snow hits the streets. He starts collecting data. And he interviews as many people as he could that had cholera. And he interviews as many people as he could that didn't have cholera. And what John Snow found is a researcher's dream. He found causal, a perfect binary in his data. What John Snow found is that every single person in London that had cholera drank from that water fountain. And every single person that didn't. So John Snow got a saw, and he cut the handle off, and cholera stopped. Stop drinking from the poison well of an equal education system. There is simply no data that suggests that it has us on the path to a pluralistic, multiracial democracy. And in point of fact, all the data suggests that it's moving us rapidly away from that. So if you're data-driven, then pay attention to the data, and you'll know that equity is the right move. But equity is not a soft pivot. Equity is a hard pivot. Equity means digging into the foundation and fundamentally rethinking the for what. Because in an equity model, if you're hungry, you get food. If you're thirsty, you get water. If you're hella thirsty, you get hella water. In an equity model, you get what you need when you need it. Now, I find a lot of districts that are having the equity conversation are taking care of the front part of this, paying more attention to what children need. The part that I think we're still struggling with is the second part, the when. Because when you start saying when you're going to do it, now power is on the hook. If you just say what you're going to do, but you never say when you're going to do it, then you can hand wring forever, right? You can say that you're working on it, right, with no real delivery date. And we wouldn't accept that from Amazon. Right? I don't know why we're willing to accept it from our public school system. And if you're going to do this work, if you're really going to pivot towards equity, then I think Maslow offers us a good starting point. Now, many of the districts that I'm supporting, doing work in, having conversations with, in addition to calling themselves data-driven, they also say they want to be research-based. Cool. I guarantee you there is nothing being used in your school or your district that has the research base of Maslow. I'll stake my career on that statement. Maslow released the hierarchy of needs in 1943. Across disciplines, public health, social epidemiology, neuroscience, child psychology, the medical field, all agree that Maslow's onto it. So when you start thinking about your classroom culture, your school culture, your curriculum, your pedagogy, your professional development, check in with Maslow. When you start thinking about that child that gives you homicidal thoughts, don't lie. I know they're in your mind right now. Start with Maslow and go to the base. We have over 4 decades of research on the practices of our most effective educators around the country. And the similarities across their work across those 4 decades is striking. What teachers that tend to find the most success, despite the political climate, whether you're talking about No Child Left Behind, whether you're talking about STAR testing, whether you're talking about Common Core, the most successful teachers over time have historically focused on these 3 things: relationships, relevance, and responsibility. And it is a reason that those teachers tend to consistently, no matter what the political climate is, no matter what the policy climate is, seem to be able to sort it out with any children that are put in their charge. So, for the second half of this talk, what I want to do is armor you up. Okay? Because you shouldn't be having debates about whether or not these are the 3 domains we need to focus on developing our teachers, school climates, and cultures around. In the research community, there is no debate about it. The only place it gets debated is amongst ideologues. And when you have an ideological debate with people that are not moral, the best you can hope for is a stalemate. Okay? So don't have that debate. There is no debate in the research community about what matters and why it matters. So I want to armor you up with some of the best research that we have, okay, so that you can stop having these debates and you can just hand out reading assignments. Tell them, when you finish this, then let's talk. Okay, so I start with Herb Kohl, who wrote a book called I Won't Learn From You. Okay, and Herb was one of the first researchers to study children that are failing in school, right? Because he was so interested in them. How many of you have young people that show up every day, and then it gets to the marking period and you're going to give out grades, and you look at your grade book and they have straight up zeros? How many of you have that kid? Yeah, right? Well, Herb says that's your most dedicated student. I mean, just think about that. They show up every day and don't do shit. That's discipline. Herb coined a phrase to describe those students. He called them willed not learners. Okay, so think about that concept, right? For children to come to school and not learn from us takes a conscious effort on their part. They're willfully not learning from us. And the most famous quote from that book actually comes from a student. When Herb's interviewing him and he's asking this kid about this, like, yo, man, you show up every day and you don't do it. What is that about? And he says, Herb, I don't care what you know until I know that you care. If you've taught a day, right, you know that at the end of the day, teaching and learning always, always, always boils down to one thing and one thing only, and that's relationships. Curriculum will not save us. You can have the dopest curriculum ever. If kids are not feeling you, right, they won't care. You can also have the wackest curriculum ever. Right? And if kids are feeling you, they'll tolerate you. I'm not saying curriculum doesn't matter, but curriculum, we've invested so much in curriculum without attention to developing teachers that can really build deep, meaningful relationships with children. And the research supports this, right? That without the connectedness that comes from attached relationships, right, the neuroscience gets more complicated. It's much more difficult to learn without that connection. Robert Sapolsky's book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, is mandatory reading in virtually every medical field. Sapolsky runs a neurobiology lab at Stanford. Now, I don't actually recommend this book, right, because it's like 600 pages in 6-point font. Okay, so unless you nerd out on like neuroscience like I do, it's probably not that fun of a read. But there's a great documentary film that basically covers the trajectory of this research that you can get on Netflix and most any other similar server, and it's called Stress, the Silent Killer. Brené Brown's work has helped us understand the distinction between sympathy and empathy. And it's crossing that bridge, okay, from a sympathetic, a pobrecito relationship, right, to children, okay, versus a connected, caring relationship to children. That's the sympathy-empathy gap. And when we close that gap, what we find in the neuroscience, what we find in the psychology, is that it's that connectedness that actually opens up the neural pathways, that actually opens up the biochemical responses that allow for children to really deeply learn, okay, and for teachers to really deeply connect to that learning. And the list goes on and on and on, from the top research institutions in the nation. There is no debate in the research community about how much attached, connected relationships matter. If that is not a focus of the professional development, the professional support and coaching, and the leadership at the school, then you don't have a fighting chance to move the numbers on the outcomes. If you get those kind of relationships, okay, then the question is, well, what are we actually teaching our babies? Now, I'm not big on checklists, but I'm going to give you one right now. If you want your school climate and culture and your curriculum to be culturally responsive, to be culturally sustaining, to be community responsive, here's your checklist. Edge to edge, top to bottom, every space should meet this checklist. Not just the ethnic studies class, okay, but every space in the school space should reflect students' lives, their communities, their families, and their ethnic, cultural, and linguistic histories. That is the only way that we've actually achieved a community responsive and culturally relevant environment. And again, the research concurs. And again, it's cross-disciplinary. This is not just educational research that is supporting this claim. This is research across fields that is crystal clear about the importance of relevance. Okay? It's not a fad. It's not something that's cool. Okay? It is essential. It is bedrock foundational if we're going to create school environments that are actually engaging and meaningful to children. There is no other option. We have to become more relevant. And here's why. Okay, I want you to understand the flow about what happens to a child when they are in community and culturally relevant environments. Okay, the first thing that happens is it begins to develop their knowledge of themselves. That's the essence of learning. Okay? That's where it begins. And if the child cannot see themselves in what you're teaching, okay, then they'll always see themselves as distant, removed from what schools consider to be valuable knowledge. Okay? And that disconnectedness is toxic to their body and their brain. Okay? It doesn't just create disengagement. Okay? It literally kills them. It literally toxifies their body. Okay? And the reason why is because without that connectedness, their self-esteem is undermined. But when a child is connected to what a teacher is actually bringing to the curriculum, okay, their self-esteem goes up. Where did y'all see self-esteem earlier in this presentation? Maslow. Where in Maslow? Okay. Right, it's the window into the top. Okay? It's the last phase before one self-actualizes. If you do not have strong self-esteem, okay, what we know in the research is that you cannot consistently self-actualize. So if you want children, okay, to start reading better, pay attention to their self-esteem. The kids who are going to struggle the most on your literacy program are the kids who think the least of themselves. And you can send them to reading tutoring over and over and over again. If that reading is not about self-love, it's not going to stick. And that's why so many of our struggling readers, despite all these literacy interventions, continue to struggle in reading. Because we're banging on their head instead of paying attention to their heart. You win the heart to win the head. And the kids that are showing up, quote unquote, ready to learn. I've been teaching for 25 years in my community, and I've yet to meet a child who isn't ready to learn. I met a bunch of people who ain't ready to teach. But in my 25 years, I've never had a child from my community show up not ready to learn. But in the way we talk about those kids, what we're really talking about is children that don't understand their own sacredness, that don't understand their own value, that don't love themselves for who they are. And what they've been taught is to hate themselves, the color of their skin, the texture of their hair, the language they speak, the neighborhood they come from, who their parents are, their country of origin, their neighborhood, their history, their ancestors. And once you're taught that long enough, the likelihood that you ever love yourself, okay, is almost assured to not happen. And the reason for that, right, is that the kids with the lowest self-esteem tend to lack hope. The medical field is now really interested in hope because it's the one thing that they've been able to connect directly, right, to a young person's ability to effectively navigate toxic stress. Okay, so if you've got kids that are living, hey, in high-stress environments, kids that are experiencing a lot of trauma, hey, one of the most important antidotes that you can give them, the best armor you can equip them with, is hope. And hope is directly connected to the things that are dropping into it on that slide, which they are no longer showing you because they're having technical difficulties. Okay. So that knowledge of self increases self-esteem. Okay. And that self-esteem, okay, increases hope levels. And the hope levels, okay, increase the likelihood that children effectively navigate what Claude Steele refers to as stereotype threat. You want me to reset it? Let's see if this works. Oh, I gotta use it on the monitor. That's a trip. I know you can see it, but I can't see it. There we go. How about now? Yee! Look at that. That's also 25 years of teaching. Never panic. Because once you panic, the kids know they got you. He's fucked up right now. Let's get him. It's all good. It's all good. Hey, how many of you test kids? Stop lying. Every hand in the room should be up. Hey, look, I don't have a problem with testing. I have a problem when testing gets out of its proper place, when it gets hyper-emphasized. I test because I want to test for learning. Right? But when it becomes the end-all and be-all, we stop teaching and we just keep testing. But if you're going to test, it's important that you know how testing affects children's physiology. Okay? There is no book that helps us better understand that than Claude Steele's Whistling Vivaldi, who introduced us to the concept of stereotype threat, which helps us understand what's actually going on in kids' brains and their biochemistry when they're introduced to a stereotype. And what is the stereotype about kids of color and kids in poverty on tests? That we don't naturally do well on those things. And what we now know is that when a stereotype is introduced to the brain and the body has a biochemical reaction that literally blocks neural pathways. And so when you put a kid in front of a test, and that kid believes that that test is going to measure their innate test-taking ability or their innate intellectual ability, and all of what society has told them is that they're not innately good at that, their neural pathways get blocked. How many of you have students that can literally do the work, and then they sit exam and they choke? We now know why. Because when you sit that exam and the stereotype is in the room and it's always in the room, their body releases a set of chemicals that shut down access to their brain. So they know the material, but the biochemical reaction they're having prevents them from accessing it. So Steele gives really concrete examples about what teachers can do to interrupt that stereotype threat. And when you do that, you create what psychologists refer to as the Pygmalion effect, the self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay? Children reflect back to you what they think you think about them. And if children really believe that you think they're brilliant, it will manifest as such. But if children think that you think they're not capable, it will manifest as such. Okay? We've seen this over and over in studies inside of psychology. And what we know is that what produces that kind of positive Pygmalion effect is what Carol Dweck refers to as a growth mindset. But not a growth mindset for children, a growth mindset for grown-ups. Okay? The problem with the growth mindset work is that it keeps trying to change kids. It keeps trying to change our communities. It keeps trying to change our families. Didn't your mama ever tell you if it ain't broke? Stop trying to fix the babies. They're not broken. The system's broken. The growth mindset has to happen in adults. Okay? And when the growth mindset happens in adults, it naturally happens in children. If you have students that are not reflecting a growth mindset back to you, what they're reflecting back to you is your growth mindset. Okay? So if you want that child's growth mindset to flip, you have to flip it with that child. Now I end with the third domain, which is responsibility. Of all the stuff I've read, no book has more impacted my day-to-day practice and the way I think about responding to my most wounded children, the kids that are carrying the highest trauma loads, than this book. Okay, Bruce Perry why they consider the nation's leading clinical expert on trauma. I think the nation's leading cultural expert on trauma is actually in California. His name is Maestro Jerry Teo, and he runs the National Compadres Network. Okay? So some combination of clinical and cultural, right, is a sweet cocktail, okay, that allows us to be more responsive to the kids, okay, who are the least likely to show up filled up with that self-esteem that we were talking about. And when you run into that kid, okay, triple down on Maslow. Go again and again and again. Because the first time you try to come, hey, with that connectedness and that care, they'll reject you because they don't know how to receive that yet. Everything they've been taught from their life experience is that adults can't be trusted, that systems do harm. So don't expect them to just be like, oh, thank God you showed up in my life. I'm so grateful for you. Okay? Nah, they're going to buck you, okay? Because people like you hurt me. And hurt people hurt people. So that kid will bang on you the hardest to keep distance from you. Okay? And you've got to be able to understand where that's coming from so that you can Bruce Lee it. Okay? So you can be like water and be like, yeah, okay? Bring that again. We're all good. Some other light reading for you in case you get bored. Robert Putnam. Oxford called Robert Putnam the world's most influential scholar. His work is really investigating, hey, about how isolated we're becoming in modern societies. Okay, Bowling Alone in his second book, Our Kids, are two great reads for teachers to understand just the way you set up your classrooms can create individualization and isolation. Hey, if kids aren't feeling connected to each other, hey, they're not maximizing the learning capacity of the classroom. It's such a trip to me to be in a room, hey, filled like this with tables that are circles, knowing that we're going back to classrooms with cemetery rows. The very structure and nature of the way you set up your classroom creates connectedness, hey, or isolation. Unnatural Causes in the middle of this slide. It's a great film series put out by PBS, tons of resources for teachers. It is the largest study ever conducted by the research community on inequality. It is a global study of the question at the bottom of the slide, is inequality making us sick? Short answer, yes. Biggest threat to health on the planet is inequality. So if you want a healthy classroom, if you want a healthy school, if you want a healthy community, if we want a healthy state, if we want a healthy nation, if we want a healthy planet, at the top of our list has to be the eradication of all forms of inequality. No oppression Olympics. You can't be confronting white supremacy and ignore class supremacy. You can't confront class supremacy and ignore male supremacy. You can't confront male supremacy and ignore heterosupremacy. You can't confront heterosupremacy and ignore xenophobia and language supremacy. All forms of inequality on the table all the time. Any form of inequality odious to the children that we serve. And you don't need to wait for your district initiative for that. Okay? You can dig where you stand. All right? Make it your goal between now and June that the space where you serve, the place where you drop your shovel every day, okay, inequality is odious there. Will not be tolerated in any way, shape, form, or fashion. And if we're going to do that, then we have to pay attention to Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Michelle makes a very clear connection between what's happening in schools and the pathway to the pen. Writing a referral is not a benign act. If you put ink to paper on a child about their behavior, okay, it increases the likelihood that they're going to contact juvenile justice. And if they contact juvenile justice, it increases the likelihood that they're going to contact the state pen. We have to change the way in which we deal with student behaviors that are inconvenient for the classroom. And it's not enough to say we won't write referrals. Okay? We've got to give teachers other options. Okay? So we can't just tell them you can't do that anymore. Okay? We have to say you can't do that anymore because you can do these things. Okay? So the work has to cut both ways. Now I'll end giving you a look into my classroom. Just in case you think I'm just up here talking shit. I actually do the work too. When I think about my responsibility as an educator, I think about this young woman and the story that she's going to share with us. Now, I want to be clear with y'all that this did not happen overnight. Okay? As a teacher in my 25 years, I kept consistently looped with kids. Okay, so this is year 2 of a 4-year loop with her. Right? So it took me a year and 6 weeks to get to this place with her and this class where we could have this kind of truth-telling as a part of our pedagogy and curriculum. I will also add that what she says here may trigger some of you. Okay? And if it triggers you, take the space that you need. And if you see your colleague get triggered, please acknowledge their humanity.
My poem is called More Scars Than Birthdays. If I had a gun pointed to my head and my life flashed before my eyes, I would see the times I would smoke with my cousins, drinking, smacking, doing powder till I knew I was too gone, cheating on my boyfriend with my ex because he would tell me he still loved me, lying to the people I love, hurting the people that care about me the most, and then I would see the reason why. I would see a little girl
You can do it. Okay. We're with you.
I would see a little girl getting raped at the age of 4 years old. She didn't know what to do or who to talk to. She was so afraid that she would cry and not tell anybody. She stayed silent. I would see 4 years passing by, rape after rape after rape. I would see an 8-year-old girl with more scars than birthdays. I would see a 13-year-old girl getting raped by her first real boyfriend. I would see a girl who didn't know how to love herself. I would see me. And if I had a gun pointed to my head and I had minutes left to live, I would tell that little girl it's okay to tell your mom. It's safe to cry. Go through your pain so you can heal. Drugs will not heal your pain, will not block it out. Love yourself. One day, trust somebody, love somebody. Let yourself be loved. If I had a gun pointed at my head, I would cry and tell 15-year-old me, I love you, don't regret your mistakes. Because I've learned that my mistakes are the lesson I needed to learn so I could create a better future.
When I think about my responsibility as an educator, I think about that child. If our schools cannot meet the needs of that child, we are failing as a pluralistic, multiracial democracy. Now, the Cherokee, end where I began. Cherokee people, like many indigenous communities, have a story about this little boy who's out in his front yard and he's playing. He comes running into the house and he runs up to his abuelita. He says, "Abuelita, I feel like there's a war going on inside my head." And she says, "There is, mijo." He says, "Who's fighting, abuelita?" She says, "The 2 wolves." He says, "Who are the 2 wolves, abuelita?" She says, "One wolf is rage, avarice, greed, selfishness, anger." He says, "Who's the other wolf, abuelita?" She says, "The other wolf is cariño, familia, unity, love, empathy. He says, who wins, abuelita? She says, the one you feed. This wolf is alive in every single one of us, every child that we serve, every family that crosses our path. That's not the question. The question is whether or not the purpose of our public education system will be to feed that wolf that finally puts us on the path to the promises that we've been giving to children and families. If I can help you in any way on that journey, please do not hesitate to reach out. And I leave you with this final thought, that the point of public education in this nation is not to escape poverty. The point of education is to end it. And if I can help you in your work in any way on that journey, I cannot promise you answers. I can promise you commiseration, a drink at a bar, and maybe a few resources that can push you further down that path. I thank you for the work that you do every day to support young people and families, particularly those that need us the most. Thank you.